Welcome back to Human Geography, students. The chapter 12 is called Settlements, but I'm going to refer to it here as Urban Geography because that's mostly what I'm going to be talking about today. And you can pick up the other information in the textbook about rural settings and about typographies and patterns of settlement. But we're mostly going to focus on cities, and cities sort of hold a magical place in the imagination of many people. And if I show you some images of cities, you can probably instantly recognize some of the iconic kind of skylines of these places. This one is in Sydney, Australia. You probably got the last one. This is in Vietnam. This one is a little bit harder, but this is Singapore, one of the wealthiest, probably the wealthiest city in all of the world. And this one is located on Lake Michigan. Maybe you've been there. This building right here is probably the most famous part of this skyline. Used to be called the Sears Tower. It's called something else now. It used to be the tallest building in the world as well. So this is Chicago. And then finally we get back to our city, the ATL. Hopefully you can kind of recognize this skyline. A couple of buildings here kind of make it obvious, and then the Ferris wheel, which is called something else. I don't remember what it's called, but the convention center is near here, Centennial Park, all that kind of stuff. So we're going to talk about cities a little bit, and we're going to try to clarify some terms so we can understand this, because most of the world now lives in an urban area, but when you hear urban area, this is usually what you think of, right? Skyscrapers and tall buildings and massive development. And most people don't live in this, like this thing that we're looking at, right? And that's true of Atlanta as well. Most of us that live in the Atlanta area don't live downtown. We live in the suburbs. So we're going to kind of tease that out a little bit as we move on. So let's start with a map. Okay, although we might say we live in the city of Atlanta and Atlanta is our city, you may or may not feel that way. I feel that way. Even though we are all the way out here in kind of the center, northern part of Gwinnett County, and the city center is more down here, this is Midtown, etc., there's something called the metropolitan statistical area. And so the Atlanta metro area is bound by this red boundary right here that includes several different counties, including Cherokee County, Pickens County, etc. You don't need to know the names of all of these. But it stretches a good distance from the city center. And some of these places, if you travel to them, they feel very, very rural. Lots of fields and open space. Newton County, you start to get this, and out in Jasper County, etc. But they're still considered to be part of the Atlanta metro area, which is comprised of almost 6 million people. Okay? So we can start with that, and this shows you a little bit of something about income, which isn't really related to this chapter as much, but it's sort of interesting to look at always, right? You can clearly see this north-south divide, and this is kind of the city center right here. So depending upon which direction you're traveling to get to the city, your experience is very different. So let's do some basics. If we look at the population of the world in 1800, we did have massive numbers of cities, but very few people lived in or even near cities in 1800, just a little over 200 years ago now. And the largest city in the world was Beijing, China, followed by London, Guangzhou, Tokyo, Constantinople, etc. But if you think about this, just a little over 200 years ago, most of the world's largest cities were in what part of the world? It's not quite obvious, but look at number 1 and number 3 and number 4 and number 5 and number 8 and number 9 and number 10. It becomes a little bit more obvious. Yeah, it's Asia. Okay, then we jump forward 100 years, and the 1800s were a massive time of industrialization throughout Europe. And so what we see is that the cities that are growing the fastest and become the mightiest cities in the world are in Europe and North America. So London, New York, Paris, Berlin, Chicago, Vienna, etc. If we move forward another 100 years, guess what's happened? I think you know the answer here. But where are the world's largest cities again in 2018? Asia, Asia, Asia. Africa, Asia, Asia, Asia. So today in the 21st century, the world's fastest growing cities and the world's largest cities are all in Asia. I shouldn't say all in Asia, are predominantly in Asia. The cities that are growing the fastest are in Asia and also in Africa. Okay, so if we pull this list up another 20 years from now, you're going to see a whole set of cities on this list that maybe you haven't even heard of before in 2019 that are just growing incredibly rapidly. The important point here is that this growth and dynamic economy that's happening in Asia is not necessarily something that's brand new. It may seem that way in the European context of the last couple hundred years, but the reality is that Asia in many ways is kind of returning to a sort of dominance that it had a couple hundred and 300 and 400 and 500 and 600 years ago. So it's not a huge historical surprise that we're seeing this massive urbanization and urban development that's happening in places like Shanghai and Seoul and Taipei, etc. Okay? So let's talk about a couple of terms. The first one here, actually just one term for now, is this term megalopolis. Kind of a weird word to say. And so we can take the city of Seoul, which is in South Korea. It's one of the largest cities in the world, around 12 million or so, which is right here. And we can think about this term megalopolis in the context of this. That on this map, the city of Seoul looks to be separate from the city of Suwon down here and of Incheon, which is over here. It's a coastal city. But the reality is that if we look at this in a different way, if we look at this according to population density, what you start to see is that all around Seoul, to the north, south, east, and west, and all the way along to the coast, and actually even further beyond the coast, you have this massive population density. So if you travel on a train or in a car from Seoul to Incheon, like this along this highway, you're never going to see countryside. It's urbanized all the way through. Now, just 30 years ago or so, you would get outside of Seoul and you would begin to see some rice farms happening out here and some countryside, some rural settings, and then you would begin to arrive in Incheon and you would know that when you're arriving in the city. But this is known as a megalopolis, right? The combination of these two urban areas into one kind of super huge urban area. And there are lots of examples of this happening. Within Europe, there's a megalopolis kind of all the way throughout central England and across the Netherlands and into the center and southern part of Germany down into northern Italy. It's known as the blue banana. You can read about that in the textbook a little bit. We see the same thing along northern Spain and southern France, right? This is heavily urbanized all the way along, so you don't really see a break, even though you see independent cities, you see Barcelona along here, etc. You get out of Barcelona, you still see urban and suburban development in massive population clusters. And so that's what we talk about when we're talking about a megalopolis. You can think of the same thing happening in the United States, but we'll talk about that in a second. So urbanization is simply the historical process whereby nations' populations are increasingly concentrated in cities, but it also refers to the expansion of cities. So in some cases, people move into the city or near the city. In other cases, the city moves into them. So all around Gwinnett County and in most suburban counties in the Atlanta metro region, you can see evidence of people or places that were very rural not that long ago. In the case of Gwinnett County, maybe 20 or 25 years ago. Not far from the college campus of Georgia Gwinnett College, you can find farm buildings. And you can find tiny bits of farms even in walking distance from GGC. So as of today, about 54% of the world's population lives in cities. In 1800, that was only 3% of the world's population. So we've experienced this massive, massive transformation on our planet in just the last 200 and a couple years. And it's worth asking ourselves whether or not this is the way that the world should be. Are we doing the right thing by all moving into cities, living closer to one another? There are clear benefits to that, right? You have access to jobs, to concerts, to sporting events, to each other. But With that also comes all sorts of perils. Things like disease can spread much more quickly. Traffic is worse. People that die from traffic accidents is almost at a level of a crisis in places like Atlanta. But nonetheless, it's a grand experiment. And maybe we'll do this for another 100 years, and then people will say, no, the cities are no good. Let's move back to the countryside. Some people do that already. So one of the problems, and one of the reasons that it's difficult to compare two urban areas or two cities, especially internationally, is that there is no single definition of what is urban. So you can read on the slide for yourself here some various legal definitions for what's considered to be urban. In Botswana, it's one thing. In Canada, it's something else. It's a population of 1,000 or more. So if you live in a place of 1,001 people, that's considered to be urban. In Canada. In Equatorial Guinea, it's 300 or more. In Japan, they only count a settlement of 30,000 people or more to be urban. And Senegal, it's 10,000, right? So you don't need to memorize any of those up here. The idea is just for us to understand that it's complicated. And the definitions kind of change over time as well. So in the United States, according to the U.S. Census Bureau, we have a couple of different designations. One of them is an urban cluster, meaning a population of 2,500 or more. If you come from a town of 2,600 people, you probably don't tell people that, yeah, you're from an urban cluster, right? But that's the definitive term for that place. And you have to keep in mind that the United States has this long history of people living in farms, right? In tiny settlements, or living in isolation from one another on the farm, especially in the Midwest and in the early days of the South, etc. The second one is an urbanized area, which is the central city plus surrounding suburbs with density of at least 1,000 per square mile. And 70% of people in the United States live in an urbanized area. And then this next one is a metropolitan statistical area, the MSA for short. You should remember that one. And so this is an urbanized area with a permanent population of 50,000 or more, the county in which it's located, and also any adjacent counties with 50% of the people commuting to the central city. So when I showed the map of Atlanta that looked like this thick red line defines the MSA, of the Metropolitan Statistical Area of Atlanta. Okay? And then I talked about a megalopolis already, but this becomes even more complicated when MSAs start bumping into each other and overlapping each other. And the classic case is this concept known as the Bosch-Wash corridor up in the Northeast, where the cities of New Jersey and New York and of Boston and New Jersey all bump up into each other, and you can't tell when you're leaving one and you're entering the other one. And this has implications for taxes and everything like that when people are living inside of one city limits but they're functionally a part of another one. You can see this starting to happen in Atlanta as Atlanta is expanding. So places like Sandy Springs, like Lawrenceville, that used to be really small towns in essence, are now becoming and acting and connecting with the larger metro area of Atlanta. And you see that even in the urban form, right? When you look at the kind of development that's happening in places like Duluth and Lawrenceville and Sandy Springs and Alpharetta, right? These places are looking more like mini cities themselves. So the green dots are urban clusters, so these are places of 2,500 or more, and obviously there are just thousands and thousands of these in the U.S. Okay, here's Chicago right here, Minneapolis, and then you notice that there really are very few cities. So you can take a quick look at this map and you can see where there are cities of 50,000 or more, and some states have very few of them, like North Dakota and South Dakota, Nebraska, okay, and there's a distinct geographic pattern to that. So just to take one more example, if we look at the map on the right, the kind of reddish area shows the city limits of St. Louis, and I have the same thing on the left. So this is the city limits of Atlanta, and the population of Atlanta, strictly speaking, is only around 500,000 people. The population of St. Louis is also very small. I don't have a number for you. But if we look at the MSA, the Metropolitan Statistical Area of Atlanta, is around 6 million people, making it the 9th largest city in the U.S. So we can't really use the city limits. We have to look at the MSA to get a meaningful comparison. So as I've already talked about, urbanization has been accelerating in recent years, and most of these cities are increasingly connected to one another. So in 1950, we really had a very tiny number of megalopolis cities, right, that were mega cities. One in North America, one in South America, a couple in Europe, and a couple in Asia, and that was it. And so this growth of cities is, as I've said, absolutely transformational, and it's not slowing down. Well, it's slowing down a little bit in places like North America and in South America, but it's accelerating all throughout Africa and all throughout Asia like this. So this is 2015, and as we move forward, we'll see that that cities are growing even faster in the coming decades. So we can look at some regional variation here. This shows differences by year, and so as a planet, we're kind of in the purple to blue area here. So we've crossed the threshold where more than half of the world's people live in cities on the entire planet in 2019. But by 2030, we're going to see almost 2/3 of the world's people living in cities, and probably by 2050, almost 70%. Okay, so this is something that's a more recent phenomena in Africa. So again, we want to look at kind of between the purple and the blue areas right here. So Africa still has more than half of its population living in small villages and in the countryside. Asia has become heavily urbanized, but it's very, very recent. Europe passed the threshold back in the 1950s, and as did Latin America, really, and North America as well. So we have an urbanization rate of somewhere around 80% in Latin America, in North America, and in Europe. And we're going to increase that a little bit, but we're not increasing it nearly as fast as they are in Asia and in Africa. So here's just another way to think about it. This shows kind of the state of the world in 2018, which is the latest data that we have, that shows whether the majority of the people that live there are living in rural areas or they're living in urban areas. So I have a link from this particular map because it links to a page that has a lot better information than what I can provide in a single slide. So what I'm going to invite you to do here, if I can click and get the link to come up, there it is right there. I'm going to ask you to jump out of this recording for just a couple minutes and take that link and type it into a browser window, and you should find a web page that looks something like this. And I'm going to ask you to read through that a little bit to get a little bit more information, and then scroll down to this map, and you'll be able to hold your mouse over any country and see the rate of urbanization in each place. And so there's one place on this map that has oh, and by the way, one of the things you're going to have to do is on this webpage, scroll down, and you'll have to move this bar so that you get to 2018 or 2019. Okay, it doesn't matter. So make sure you move this bar to get to the right year. And I want you to find the country on the map that has the lowest rate of urbanization. And it's a country, obviously, that's going to be in one of the green areas, and it should be around 13% if you find the right country. And that's going to be one of the answers on the lecture quiz. So make sure that you go and do that, okay? So you can pause this recording or do whatever you need to do, but make sure you step out and do that. And you can see which areas have become urbanized, more urbanized, and when, according to that dynamic map. It's kind of a cool tool. So just a little bit of history. We've kind of hit these areas before. They should look familiar to you, because when we looked at agricultural hearths, these are the exact same locations that we talked about then. So Mesoamerica, the Nile Valley, Mesopotamia, also known as the Fertile Crescent right here, the Indus Valley between kind of India and Pakistan, and then finally, I'm just going to call it Eastern China right here. These are the places where we find the earliest cities. And the reason that they were able to manage kind of a new kind of society was because they handled the food problem first. This is where the earliest religions begin. This is also where the earliest cities began. And so all those things are connected to one another. Okay, and there is kind of an interesting geographic pattern a little bit. They all tend to kind of happen at a fairly similar latitudinal location across the planet. So all of these things happen north of the equator, not south of the equator. And there's been a lot of discussion about why that might be. But that's where you find the earliest cities. If we look at the growth of cities in recent years, a lot of it is uncontrolled kind of growth. And so this is an image of Sao Paulo, Brazil, one of the fastest growing cities in the world. And it's a little bit difficult to make out from this picture, but this city just goes on for miles and miles and miles like this. And we'll talk about the sprawl here in just a second. But let's look at the four main reasons for urbanization. And I'm going to go through these quickly because I think they're kind of obvious. The first one is population growth. And so, as we've talked about for a couple of chapters now, we entered the baby boom, we had high fertility rates, people lived and continue to live longer, and so we just need more places to go. But that's only part of the story, right? The other one is technology, and so cities have been able to contain far more people than ever before. We're able to live on smaller plots of land. We're able to transport food, as you saw in Exercise 5, through the food super highway. And then number 3 is because of industrialization. So the earliest reason, I shouldn't say the earliest reason, but the biggest factor in drawing millions and millions of people to the cities in the 19th and 20th centuries has been industrialization. That's where the jobs were. If you were going to leave the farm, you needed something else to do. And so anytime that the Industrial Revolution takes hold in a country, it leads to massive urbanization. People move to the cities. In the early days, it wasn't a very pleasant place to live, but that's where the jobs were. So there was a lack of sanitation, a lack of safety, a lack of the rule of law, and all kinds of things, but jobs drew people into the cities nonetheless. And then finally, there's the issue of social reasons. So every day somebody leaves their small town in rural Tennessee or rural Illinois or rural China and moves to the city, partly because of a job and in search of economic prosperity, but also for cultural reasons, right? Or for social reasons, to kind of find their place, to make their mark, to search for something bigger than themselves. And the city is usually the place where people go to do that. If you have aspirations of becoming an actor, you move to New York or LA. If you have aspirations of becoming a country music singer, you move to Nashville, Tennessee, or maybe Branson, Missouri. I don't know. So here's another way to look at the largest metro areas in the United States, at least. We can look at them according to their population, but also according to their GDP. This is sort of interesting to look at. So if you want to know why New York and New York City and the New York MSA dominates the media, dominates politics, it's because of its massive economic power and also its massive population. But those two things go hand in hand. So New York, Los Angeles, Chicago. Number 4 is Dallas-Fort Worth, Washington, D.C., Arlington, Baltimore area. Then Houston, San Francisco, Philadelphia, Boston. And then here comes us. Number 10, Atlanta, Sandy Springs, Roswell. So the name of our metropolitan statistical area includes not just Atlanta, but Sandy Springs, Roswell, and Roswell as well. So we're the 9th largest metro area, and so it would make sense that we're the 10th largest economic area in the United States. Whoops, sorry about that. We could also look at things like this: America's fastest and slowest growing job markets. And so we've talked about this in class throughout the semester, but Atlanta is clearly an area that is booming, where there's building happening. You can just drive around the city and you can see the construction, you can experience the traffic, you can look for a job and you can find it, even if it's not the job that you want. So from 2012 to 2017, Atlanta has been the second fastest growing job market in the entire country, following only Miami. And if we look at this list, we can start to make some generalizations here, right? So if you were to think about what region of the U.S. is experiencing the fastest job growth, it's kind of obvious, right? Atlanta, Fort Worth, Austin, Raleigh, Charlotte, right? So two of them in North Carolina, Nashville. Yeah, it's our region, the Southeast. And so if you're frustrated by traffic, then blame your neighbor or blame your parents for moving here, because that's what's happening, is that the Atlanta metro area is going to add somewhere between 2 and 3 more million people by 2030, just in the next 11 to 12 years alone. So the traffic is going to get worse. Will the job growth continue? It's hard to say, but it appears as though that's going to be the case. And so where are all those people coming from? Well, some of them are international. Some of them are migrating from other countries. But a lot of people are moving to the Atlanta metro area and to Raleigh and to Charlotte and these southern cities from other parts of the country. So they're moving from kind of the Great Plains out west, from Tulsa, Memphis, Albuquerque, Wichita, Arlington, Indianapolis. My former home state of Indiana is not doing so great when it comes to growing the economy. A lot of Midwestern cities here. This one is Northeast, but Milwaukee is in the Midwest, Indianapolis in the Midwest, Wichita and Tulsa are kind of in the Midwest as well. Let's talk a little bit about the characteristics of inner cities, and this is somewhat unique to American cities, although not entirely. You find the same things in other cities, although there are different dynamics that I'll talk about in a second, especially when we compare European cities to North American cities. But one of the things that we find are physical problems, physical infrastructure, things like roads that aren't kept to standard and sewage systems that are overwhelmed. Okay, that's what we mean by physical problems. And you can travel to certain parts of Atlanta or DC or Chicago and you can find this. All right, so there's been a deterioration. It's easy to build something from scratch. It's much harder to maintain it over the long term. And so oftentimes during presidential debates, you'll hear candidates talk about this, that we need to do something about our country's decaying infrastructure. And very often they're referring specifically to cities where you have major pothole problems, or, as I've said, sewage systems that can't manage to take care of waste material or provide adequate clean drinking water. This is something that happened in Flint, Michigan a couple of years ago. Okay. A part of that process has to do with urban renewal. This is something that's been talked about in this country for a long time, right? How can we bring these cities kind of back from the brink? And we're seeing that happen in some places. The next one is more of a social problem, right? Inner city social problems have been a dominant feature of certain parts of American cities. So endemic homelessness and the drug trade and crack houses and this kind of development of the urban underclass, a whole set of people that live in the city that don't have any connection, any way to get out of the city or to find a way kind of to move beyond their situation. So really high unemployment rates in particular neighborhoods and cities, high rates of illiteracy, drug addiction, crime, alcoholism, homelessness, all this kind of stuff that I think we're all aware happens in certain portions of most American cities. And most of this is tied to structural poverty. And by that we mean not just that you are poor at the moment, but that you're born into a kind of poverty that tends to perpetuate itself over time. and you can't find the model in the pathway to getting out of that, and you don't have a lot of examples of others that have done it. And then the third one is related to all of them, obviously, is economic problems. So there was a time in which most of the job creation was happening in the city. So African Americans that left the American South, as we've talked about, when they moved to the American North, they moved into cities. And the reason they did that was because there were good, decent paying factory jobs. The same was true of Atlanta for a time. But what's happened is that cities have changed. So we experienced this idea of industrial relocation. So we talked about that in the last chapter, that manufacturing no longer has to be located in the city, near the river, on the lake, next to the railroad station, the way that it used to. And so as manufacturing has relocated to the suburbs, into rural areas, this has sort of emptied out all kinds of opportunities that used to exist in the city. So if you're left behind in that situation, there aren't a lot of opportunities left for you to make a living in some parts of the city, especially if you don't have an education, if you didn't finish high school, if you don't have a college degree, if you don't have the right kind of skills, etc. This makes life in the city very difficult for a certain segment of the population. A lot of this has been kind of exacerbated by the notion of white flight. Hopefully this is a term you've heard before, but if not, make sure you write that one down. So in essence, what happened was that as African Americans moved into cities, especially during World War I and World War II, and started to work alongside other mostly white workers, that as white workers experienced upward economic mobility, they left the cities, and they left in great numbers. And this was followed by black flight, so upper middle class and wealthy black families did the same thing. They started to move to the suburbs. Cars became a lot cheaper. Governments began to build highway systems. And so people that could afford to leave the city did. Right? This started happening really in the 1940s, 1950s, in large scale, continued all throughout the 70s, 80s, and 90s. Most suburbs in Gwinnett County were built in the 1990s. And if you meet people, it's very common to find that their stories somehow connected to moving to this area in the 1990s. And so a lot of people left the city. When middle class and upper middle class people left the city, whether they were white or black, or they were children of immigrants or whatever, it had this really deleterious and negative effect on the city, because when the wealthiest people left the city, they took with them not just their bodies and their skills and their energy, but they also took their tax dollars. So if you want a simple explanation for why some parts of American cities have been so left out and are so full of poverty and physical infrastructure problems and social problems, it's because the middle class left and hollowed out their tax money. And so when the tax money is gone, it's very, very difficult to continue to fund things like public schools and sidewalks and police officers and functioning firefighters, and all that kind of stuff that you need in a city has all left. So what we find now are that a lot of people that live in the suburbs, like many of us, we like to go into the city and sort of experience it, go to a sporting event, go to a concert, go to one of the amazing parks that's in the city. But our tax dollars don't support those very institutions that we like to go and partake of, because we or our families or those that came before us left the city and sort of hollowed it out. And that's a big problem that American cities have been dealing with now for decades and decades. So as kind of the antithesis of this idea of white flight and wealthy people leaving the cities, what we're seeing happen, and we've been seeing this now for a number of decades, is this concept of gentrification. You've probably heard this term before, but here's a definition for you. Right? It's this concept whereby wealthy people, usually professionals, people that have high incomes, oftentimes either young or maybe empty nesters, not families as much, have been moving back into poorer areas of the city, those cities that have experienced all these things that I talked about here. And they found that housing prices are really low, and so they've gone in to the city and they've moved back in because they want to be a part of the city. They want the energy that's down there. This has happened in Boston, in San Francisco, in Chicago, in Los Angeles, and it's happening in Atlanta right now in a major way, in places like Virginia Highlands, in places like Cabbagetown, the old Fourth Ward. And so on the upside, this brings economic prosperity. It brings tax dollars back into those neighborhoods. On the downside, it tends to displace poorer residents from communities that they were connected to and that they had a sense of place in. Because they're priced out of the market. They can't afford the rent. They can't afford the taxes anymore. When new restaurants come in, new grocery stores come in, etc. And so this is something that's been a problematic dynamic in many places, and it's complicated. So let's talk about suburbs a little bit. There are more people that live in suburbs in the U.S. than in any other form of community. More people live in the suburbs than in the city. More people live in the suburbs than in rural areas. More people live in suburbs than in institutions like colleges or prisons or whatever. And so the most common experience in the United States of America is the experience of the suburb. And yet we often treat it as though it's some other thing, but it's become the reality for most people in this country. I should say the largest number of people in this country in the last 3 and 4 decades. So this is a peripheral model, right? The suburb typically starts in a fashion that's separated from the city. It has its own tax base, it has its own form of government, and things like that. And while it may be based in kind of utopian ideals of how neighborhoods should look and how children should be housed or whatever, it's really a peripheral model that has its own problems. And so the first one may seem like it's not a big problem, but the density gradient. So suburbs just by default take up more space. People move to the suburbs so that they can have more space, so that they're not on top of their neighbor. And so this has a huge environmental impact. It also just takes up more and more space, which creates the need for more roads and more miles of everything, in essence. So there's a major cost to this suburban sprawl. There's a loss of farmland, there's a loss of nature, there's a loss of habitat. Sprawl oftentimes will threaten habitats of all kinds of different ecosystems. There's also a kind of suburban segregation that happens, and whether it's codified into law or not, it's something that tends to occur within suburbs. So Atlanta suburbs actually tend to be more mixed than what you find in a lot of northern suburbs, like in places like Chicago and DC and suburban Baltimore. But that's kind of a new phenomenon that we see in southern cities. The second one is related to the first one, and it has everything to do with transportation, right? So when the suburb is new, workers live in the suburbs and they drive back into the city or near the city to work or to conduct business or whatever. And so in the early phase of a suburb, it's not a big problem. But as more people move away from the city or migrate to the suburbs, this puts more vehicles on the road. This increases CO2 emissions, it increases accidents, it increases the needs for more lanes and all kinds of infrastructure that people in the suburbs don't necessarily want to pay for. They expect it to be paid for by the state or by the government. So meanwhile, you have a tax base that's been just abandoned in the inner city, and you have this whole new set of infrastructure costs that are created by people that have moved to the suburbs. And so very often suburbanites are very much against public transportation, things like MARTA or light rail transport or public transit systems, when in reality highway systems and everything that goes with the building of highways and bypasses and additional lanes and public safety that has to accompany all of that is also a form of public transportation if you think about it. You may own the car, but you don't own the road, and the road is necessary for you to use that car. To build 1 mile of interstate highway costs well over $1 million as of the latest estimates in 2019, just to give you an idea. The third problem is that we have local government fragmentation, and so people want their local tax dollars to stay with their local government. They like to have local control. They want those that tax money to go towards their schools, not somebody else's schools. And so what this leads to is all kinds of fragmentation. Instead of having kind of a mutually shared vision of where community development should go, these suburbs tend to break off into their own smaller units. And even inside of the suburb, there's often an HOA, kind of a private government entity that collects money and sort of manages things. If you're in a gated community, it controls the roads and the rules of that neighborhood and all that kind of stuff. And so it's really difficult to develop kind of a comprehensive plan for the whole city when suburban communities are breaking off and kind of creating their new forms of government that don't want to share vision and responsibilities with neighboring communities. So let's talk about 3 seconds about European cities. So European cities have really high traffic, are very congested. They've kind of gone through the same thing that North American cities went through, but long before we did. And if you think about it, they're higher density, meaning there are more people living in a smaller area. And this is because European cities are simply older. They were not built with the automobile in mind. And so the infrastructure tends to not be very welcoming to automobiles. Really narrow streets. If you've ever been to a European city or seen them on YouTube or in movies or television shows or whatever, you see this very small parking spaces because the cities were not designed with the automobile in mind. And so some European cities have taken drastic measures. So if you want to drive a car outside of London into London, oftentimes you have to get permission. You have to get kind of a visa for that car just to drive it into the city. And you have to sign some paperwork about how long you're going to have the car in the city and whether you're going to keep it there or not. Because the cities are so congested with automobiles, they've had to take extreme measures. Some cities have rules about when you can drive your car based upon the last digit of your license plate, for example. And here's the biggest difference in European cities is that the wealthy do tend to live downtown. Now you might say the same thing. Well, in Atlanta, right, we have very wealthy people that live in the city, but not all wealthy people. Most wealthy people live outside of the city. They live maybe in Cobb County, or they live in Alpharetta, or maybe here in Gwinnett County. There are some of the wealthiest athletes, for example, on the Atlanta Falcons, or the MLS soccer team, or the baseball team. Most of them do not live in the city of Atlanta. They live outside of the city. But in Europe, most of the wealthy people live in the city. The cities tend to be more walkable, more connected to each other, and this is just a cultural difference between Europe and North America. And this is where things get kind of interesting, is that the poor in Europe tend to live out in the suburbs, which is a very different kind of definition of suburbia. There are some other settlement forms. I know that this is getting kind of long. We're getting towards the end here, just to give you a heads up. Okay, so there's a couple of other different settlement forms that we'll talk about. And as I said, just as a reminder, I'm not talking about rural settlements in this chapter at all. You'll have to get that stuff from the chapter itself and make sure that you read the chapter, okay? So let's talk about informal and squatter settlements first. A squatter settlement is an area within a city in a less developed country, usually in which people illegally establish residences on land that they do not own, and they erect kind of homemade structures. The second one, smart growth, I'm kind of out of order here. I'll talk about that next. Okay, so if we look around the planet, people that are moving into cities in poorer countries around the world, when they move into the city, there's usually not an adequate amount of housing for them to move into in order to become a part of the city. And so very often when people move into the city, especially from the countryside and especially poor people, they're moving into we can call it a slum, right? And a shanty town. There's a number of different names for this. And so this has gotten better, however. So this map shows the percentage of people that are living in slums in 2014. And so India has a huge problem with this. People that move into Mumbai or New Delhi, they're moving into very, very difficult circumstances. So according to one documentary film that I think one of your classmates has watched and is going to maybe present on, you'll find that there's something like one toilet for 100 people in a slum area of Delhi. So people are living in makeshift houses that don't have any kind of running water or electricity or anything like that, at least when they first move into the city. And so this is especially problematic in sub-Saharan Africa, in places like South Sudan and in Chad and in Central African Republic and in the Congo. But there is some good news, as you can see up top here, that from 1990 to 2014, the share of the urban population in slum households fell from 44 to 25% in China, 55 to 24% in India, 37 to 22% in Brazil, and 77 to 50% in Nigeria. So poor countries are taking the issue of urbanization very seriously, and they're trying to find creative ways to provide adequate housing for the millions and millions of people that are leaving the countryside and moving into the cities. Nonetheless, we have these kinds of urban settlements. This is called a favela in Brazil, which really just means shanty town, and you can see they actually get better over time. So some of them started as shanty towns, as makeshift housing, but over time they've been turned into brick, permanent kinds of houses that are all connected to each other and actually functioning neighborhoods. And little by little, the cities of Sao Paulo and other Brazilian cities have brought infrastructure to these neighborhoods. Here's an example of a squatter settlement in Lagos, Nigeria. Oftentimes they're located near railroad tracks because that's the only land that's available. And because it's a low-lying area, there is kind of a source of water, not a very good source of water. But the train oftentimes will also provide a kind of transportation network for very poor people to get from place to place. Here's some more example. But a huge part of the problem is that you don't have anything to do with the trash or with the sewage or with waste materials. And so these can become just horrific places for the poorest people to live. And yet they're oftentimes able to make more money here living in these terrible conditions than they can back on the farm. And so this is why people do it. So let's talk about the other form of settlement. And so I have this definition of, here it is, of smart growth. So for the past 50 years, we Americans have been building a national landscape that is largely devoid of places worth caring about. American suburbanization is the geography of nowhere. So there are a number of scholars and practitioners who have looked at the way that we have designed suburbs, and they've said this is not sustainable. We can't just keep building out further and further and further from the city, and we can't build places that don't have any kind of identity, that don't have any cohesion or personal connection between neighbors. And so that's where this concept of new urbanism comes from. And this is very much a more developed country, a kind of industrialized nation, post-industrial nation really kind of idea. And so here's the definition: a counter to urban sprawl. Development, urban revitalization, suburban reforms that create walkable neighborhoods with a diversity of housing and jobs. New urbanists want to create neighborhoods that promote a sense of community and a sense of place. So think about that one for a second. If you are a suburbanite, do you have a pride in your neighborhood? Do you feel connected to the places that you live and the people that live next to you? Do you know your neighbors? For example, can you name 5 people that live within 5 minutes walk of your house. Maybe you can, maybe you can't, but if you can't, you're not alone. A lot of people feel this kind of suburban angst, this disconnect from any sense of community or place. And so this is what new urbanism tries to address. And so this is a huge leap, right, from this discussion of the urban underclass in the developing world living in shantytowns and favelas. And so this is a very privileged kind of discussion to have, but it's one that's occurring in developed countries all across the planet. So there are certain kinds of legislation that can be passed and design principles that can be followed to limit sprawl, to preserve farmland, to preserve shared space, and build community. So this is exactly what you see happening in Gwinnett County right now. You see this happening in downtown Duluth, downtown Lawrenceville, downtown Norcross, downtown Sugar Hill, downtown Beaufort, right? Is that there's this kind of realization that there's something problematic about just building and adding more and more and more suburbs. And so in some ways, this is kind of like reconstructing the city, but doing it in a suburban environment. And again, this is exactly what's happening. But the idea here is much more philosophical than maybe you might have thought of before. Okay, so if you drive around Lawrenceville, you'll see massive numbers of condos and townhomes that are going up. And in some ways, that's a symbol of wealth because those are designed for wealthier people, but they're much smaller than the traditional suburbs, right? So people are beginning to give up space and give up square footage in their homes in order to have a better sense of place and to have kind of a unique characteristic of that local place. The idea is that you don't spend every waking moment alone in your home staring at your computer or at your device, but that you actually just need a place to live and sleep and store a few things. But then you can get out of your house and you can connect to your neighbors in the common areas. So the idea is that you preserve the unique characteristics of places by preserving shared spaces. So in Lawrenceville, it's the Lawrenceville Lawn. In Suwanee, it's the Suwanee Town Center, where you have concerts and you have festivals and you have kids playing together on the lawn. The idea is to make it maybe less amenable for automobiles and more attractive and more livable for actually people that live there. And so you can find lots of examples of this. This is, again, Suwanee Town Center. And so you preserve this green space here. The homes are back behind these buildings. They're much smaller. They're built closer together, but you create a sense of place. Here's another example. And then I've got one more, I think. And this is in downtown Duluth. Okay, so these are very expensive, obviously, but just across the street you're finding smaller versions of these that are still walkable to the downtown. And these are all examples of new urbanism, kind of for the future of urban development in North America. And with that, we will end the lecture. Bye, guys.